You don't have to be a genius to know that it's quite difficult to accumulate wealth, but in particular, it's very, very difficult for people who come from ordinary or poorer backgrounds. As somebody who recently went from having only a couple of €100 to now being worth over €100,000 net worth, I feel very compelled to share my own journey in the hopes that maybe it might lead to others starting their own journey or feeling a little bit less helpless. I think when you look outside at the moment, the cost of living, the housing crisis, the advantages that ordinary folk have are incredibly slim, and the prospect of rising above being paycheck to paycheck is pretty slim for a lot of people. However, if somebody like myself can do it, no doubt others can do it as well. Hence why I feel compelled to make the video. I think it's very important to also acknowledge that when you look online and see a lot of content, because we're in the information age and there's so much information out there. There's so many content creators telling you how to make 6 figures in salary or 7 figures in net worth. I think there's a lot of disingenuous content out there because for a lot of these people, they're not being nearly as transparent enough when it comes to communicating how they got into the situations that they're in. Many of these people started off with advantages which a lot of ordinary people and poorer people would never have. And as somebody who didn't have nearly as many advantages as these kinds of people, I do want to communicate my own journey transparently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through some of the assumptions about my starting point, the privileges and the things which again were purely from scratch, just to be authentic about this, because the last thing I want this to be is a case of me flaunting about how, I'm worth X, Y, and Z. And the reason is because I had a massive inheritance or whatever it is, which is not the case. I think a lot of these content creators online are also looking to sell you something. You see a lot of people talk about the prospect of helping you gain wealth or get rich, but you have to pay for a course or buy their product or whatever it is. Now, look, with all due respect, no doubt a lot of these people are very informed. Some of them are very genuine, some of them. But there's a lot of waffle out there. And maybe people see this potential journey as waffle. Maybe it is. But at the same time, I'm not looking to sell you something. I'm just trying to give an authentic walkthrough of the strategies that I employed to get myself to the position that I'm at. And like I said, if I can do it, you can do it. So that's plenty of waffle so far. I also want to clarify that I'm not a financial advisor. Again, if you do need professional help, go seek a financial advisor. I'm simply a random ordinary schmuck who went from 0 to 100k in about a 5-year time frame. If you're looking for a quick rich scheme, this is not it. This required a lot of effort, a very clear strategy, and time. There's no hidden secret behind this type of journey. It is simply hard work and strategy and time, like I said. I suppose in terms of the video, how I'm going to actually illustrate it, for those of you who might see my other videos, I typically script my videos, and I also use a few very simple illustrations as the medium to kind of talk through the things I'm talking about. I'm probably going to use something very basic. The main focal point of the video is more the audio as opposed to the visuals. So forgive the illustrations if they're kind of below par. Again, limited talent on this side of the microphone, ladies and gentlemen. And I suppose I'm not scripting it because I feel like it would be a more authentic telling of my story by just rambling on like I do. So if that's not for you, what I'm also going to try and do is spare people the pain of listening to my voice by timestamping the video. So if you get sick of me and simply want to jump to a particular point of the video, you can use the timestamps to kind of get you there. So that's my initial introduction. I hope it gives a bit of context to the why. Simply looking to help. So here we go. Before I start the walkthrough of my starting point, I did mention how I want to walk through some of the assumptions of my starting point. I didn't receive any inheritance to get me started. I didn't have a deposit. for a home. I didn't get 50 grand as a gift from family members. I was starting with a couple of €100. Okay, so no major inheritance or major gifts or anything like that. I'm going to walk through the journey in particular, but at the point in which I consider my wealth accumulation starting point, I only had a couple of €100 in my pocket. I suppose a privilege that is important to clarify as well is I didn't have any crippling debt at this point. So I didn't have a car loan. I didn't take out loans to go on holidays. I didn't have a credit card loan or a credit union loan or any of these type of loans. And to be honest, if you do have these type of loans, whether it was for a good reason or not, don't lose hope if you also have this as part of your starting point. They're simply parts of your journey that you have to take into account when figuring out the strategy and approach that makes sense for you, okay? But for me, I didn't have any of this kind of crippling debt. I suppose a big one that a lot of creators online don't really share is a lot of them have connections to companies where they start off on big salaries, the high 5 figures or even 6 figures right out the gate. I did not start on a 6-figure or high 5-figure salary that got me to this spot, right? My first 2 salaries in the first 2 jobs that I had were 26 grand a year and 36 grand a year, which are both below and were below the average salary at the time. A lot for me coming from a broke situation, but in general, I wasn't on ridiculous money. That was the crucial factor in me accumulating wealth. So humble enough salaries. Also, another really big clarification is I navigated this journey as an employee. Essentially, I did not have my own business whereby I struck gold overnight and all of a sudden my revenue was in 7 figures and my profit was 6 figures or anything like that. This is the journey of an employee, we'll put it like that. So not a business owner. Another big advantage, no shade to those out there, right? So don't take it the wrong way. Again, it's something you have to take into account. And from a money perspective, it is a big cost, but I have no kids. I had no kids. Kids are expensive. And look, if you have them, look, it is what it is. You just have to, similar to the debt, intertwine their existence in your life into your expenses and navigate your journey with them a part of it, right? So not the end of the world, but as we know, kids are quite expensive. But most people have them. So, hey, it's just part of the journey. But for me, I didn't have them. So those are kind of the heavy hitter assumptions. If I miss anything, apologies. You can ask in the comments about certain things if you're curious. So I'm going to start off with the first step. And that, of course, is earning income. Okay, so you have to get a job. And the kind of first asset that you need to start accumulating before you can kind of invest in other assets is cash. So like I would have said, I would have had fairly humble jobs to start off with, but it took me a very long time to get those jobs. Post-college, it took me nearly a year to get that first job. I actually got both jobs offered within a week of each other. And at the time, obviously I was delighted, but I was also like, could I not have gotten one of these 6 months ago? Because I was completely broke. I was barely surviving. Strained relationships. The whole world was crashing down. Despair was kicking down my door. Yeah, look, very positive situation to be in, but ultimately, I got offered my first job, 26 grand a year job, which might not sound like a lot because it's not. But at the time, I was delighted because I had nothing. But the other job, which was actually related to what I'd studied for in higher education, was a job that wouldn't be starting for about 7 to 8 months. So in the interim, I worked the 26 grand a year job. So I worked away there. Lo and behold, right, my money accumulation journey didn't skyrocket immediately off that 26 grand a year job. I don't think I was really transparent in the kind of introduction about how I was at this point from a financial management point of view. But to be very clear, I was an absolute buffoon when it came to money management. I was incredibly self-destructive. I made so many poor financial decisions up to this point in my life. I had no money, and most of that comes down to things that were within my control, and that's fully on me to take responsibility for. So I don't hold anybody else accountable. There were things out of my control, of course, like the situation, but at the same time, I could have done better. Made mistakes, but at this point, I was starting to think, hey, maybe I'd like to turn my life around so I can actually, breathe a little easier so I'm not worrying about rent. So that was the idea at this point, but unfortunately the execution didn't happen. And it didn't really happen throughout the course of the 6-month job. The money that came in was quickly gone due to bad habits and regular bills. And at the end of it, I only had enough to pay for a deposit for the place I would have to stay to begin my second job, the 36 grand a year job. And after I'd paid the first deposit and rent, I had like only a couple of €100. So still in a fairly humble spot, I won't lie. Again, my own fault. But at this point now, the intentions are there. I'd started to kind of build up a strategy in my head. And I suppose when I realized throughout the 26 grand a year job that I wasn't going to end up with a decent chunk of money coming out of it, I thought, well, let's kind of set the formal start to my journey at the starting point of the next job, the 36 grand a year job. So when I got to that job, at this point now, to be fair, I was determined to be a lot more disciplined. I had a high level strategy. My strategy was ultimately I wanted to build up my savings very, very aggressively. Certain elements that I think are very important when it comes to putting yourself in the best place to accumulate wealth is where you live. So I think a lot of people might want to live in an apartment by themselves or with their partner. Some people might not be open to living with others. I think people who come from ordinary poor backgrounds usually live with others, and I'm certainly no different. So I thought, okay, well, let me go live with 3 to 4 other lads in a house share, which ultimately at the time I believe was around €600 in rent. And for me, given that I was earning about 2,500 quid after tax, when you add the additional bills on top of that, it would have been only about 1,100 quid in total in expenses. And when you minus my net income versus the expenses, I was earning 14, 15, 1,600 euro a month. It varied, of course, but ultimately I was saving quite a considerable chunk of my net income. I think it's fair to say I was saving around 60% usually, which I know for a lot of people might not be achievable given that they might have higher expenses because of things like debt and kids and other expenses. That's perfectly fine, but you really have to figure out what your non-negotiables are. For me, my non-negotiables were I needed to have certain food because, again, I like to eat food. Who doesn't? In addition, as well, when it came to the situation I was putting myself in, I wanted a double bedroom. Some of you might be like, I'm happy to have a single bedroom, but a non-negotiable in my book at the time was a double bedroom. Some of you might want a private bathroom. Some of you might live without it, right? So it's kind of figuring out what situation you want to put yourself in from a living standpoint. What are the expenses that have to take place, like your electricity, like your garbage, like your phone bill, internet, all these bills, like are they all necessary? What can be cut? And how aggressive do you want to be? I suppose a tip as well for me that was helpful in kind of viewing my savings as a necessity. I shifted my mindset of viewing bills as something that should be taken out of discretionary income, and more looking at it as something that should be included as part of my expenses, as sort of like a bill to myself. And what I found is psychologically that was very helpful when it came to the discretionary income I had after, because I could spend the money on stupid stuff that I wanted a lot more guilt-free than, say, if I was spending it and I still hadn't saved. And, I would have had that experience during the 26 grand a year job where I didn't make that distinction. So that was kind of a lessons learned from myself. And to be honest, it might not sound like much, but psychologically, it was actually a big thing for myself. During the time period as well, I didn't go on holidays, I didn't buy a car, I didn't have any big purchases. My whole point was to save as much as possible. And for the 2+ years that I was living like this, when you do the simple math of saving around 1,500 quid a month, over the course of 2 years, you're at like 36 to 40,000 euro, right? So that's quite a lot of cash to accumulate quickly. I think as well, this is more specific to Ireland. I do think the journey is relevant regardless of where you're at. But in Ireland, certain counties are obviously way more expensive. For somebody on 36 grand a year, prospects of living in a place like Dublin, to be honest, look, it was too expensive. Some people could, but for me, I was like, okay, let's not target Dublin for the time being at least, because obviously that rent bill was going to be a lot higher. Might have found a gem, but again, I have no connections, so no advantages in that department. But ultimately, the start of my kind of wealth accumulation journey was that cash, right? And that was that 36, 40 grand mark. The second, and what's probably the first investment vehicle that I decided to go for, was trying to invest in a starter property. Now, at this point, right, being from humble beginnings, and I think this is where a lot of Irish people in particular get stuck, is I knew very clearly, based off how institutions who lend money like banks and credit unions work, there was no way somebody like myself, who was buying by themselves on a salary at this time of €42,000, would be able to buy a 3-4 bedroom house, that's detached or semi-detached or in a good estate in, Galway or a place like Cork or Limerick or especially Dublin, but these kind of bigger places. So there's no way someone like me, unless I had an amazing stroke of luck, but I couldn't rely on that, right? So strategically, I knew houses were not for me. I thought, because of the constraints that I have to operate within, investing in a starter home versus trying to target the dream home would put me in a better spot later on. Because ultimately, instead of paying rent, which is going towards helping another person accumulate equity in their property, I would be accumulating equity in my property every time I had a mortgage payment. But also, property, typically based off historical patterns, appreciates to some degree over time. So I would eventually be in a situation in a few years, if I wanted to upgrade, instead of having all the rent essentially be dead money, I would have a decent sum of money invested via my mortgage payments as equity in the property, and also the property would have appreciated. And when I sell up, there's another advantage in Ireland where you don't pay capital gains tax if the property is your primary residence. So I would have had a substantial return on that sort of investment. And that's essentially what I did. That was my mindset. And I think with a lot of Irish people, they think about getting a home. It's all about getting the dream home, but they're not realistic. They think they're entitled to, the 3-4 bedroom home. It's a very simple game. These institutions are betting on the probability of you being able to pay back the money they've lent you, plus the interest, their profit on lending you the money. And they don't want to give you a whole lot. And if you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to be able to buy the higher end properties in today's market, because they're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, right? So you have to be realistic. You have to figure out a strategy. You have to figure out your non-negotiables, right? Non-negotiables, again, within the context of evaluating a property, semi-detached, a stay-at-home. For me, I knew, like I said, houses weren't it. So I was going for flats and apartments, which are typically cheaper. Obviously, Dublin and very expensive parts of Cork and other places are an exception, but ultimately apartments and flats across the board would be cheaper than houses. And that's eventually what I was able to get by the skin of my teeth, for transparency. I think it's important to also clarify that you do have to take a step back, or at least I did when I invested in my starter property, because, like I said, I would have had about €40,000 at the time. A lot of that had to go towards the deposit for the home. And for full transparency, if you're unaware, first-time buyer has to have at least 10% deposit in order to lock down the mortgage that's ultimately going to pay for your new home. And I think there's kind of a caveat there where, say, for example, with the bank's lending rules of 3 to 4 times your salary, I was on 42,000 a year. I was only able to get 150, 160, 170, whatever it was. And the amount, the place I bought, the 10% deposit wasn't enough to make up the difference, right? So I had to pay more. And in addition to the deposit and the kind of money in addition I had to make up, I also had to put money aside for the legal fees, the stamp duty, the survey costs, all these other fees. They came to about 6-7 grand as well, which really adds to it, right? So my cash at this point was very much decimated, but it was essentially converted into equity in an asset that was going to accumulate in value over time. And also my equity in the asset would improve over time as I paid down the mortgage. And over the last couple of years, 2-3 years that I've had it, that has obviously grown given the current state of things, and also because I've been paying it off. So there's a few tens of thousands that I have in net worth associated with my starter property. So I think if you're navigating, trying to get a home, don't think of the dream home if you're in a situation where realistically you're not going to be able to even remotely afford it. Don't be disheartened by it either, because, you know, there are alternatives like getting starter homes that maybe if you're able to, instead of the 3-4 bedroom home, able to get a 1-2 bedroom apartment, it's going to put you in a situation where you have your own space, but also you have an asset that's going to serve you better than paying rent from an accumulating wealth standpoint. Again, you know, everybody has to figure out their own tolerance and what they want to do. But for me, I thought the property route would be a good starting point. And so far, I can say I don't regret my decision. I suppose next then for me was a longer term investment that most people would be quite familiar with. I think young people are inclined to not take it too seriously, but the earlier you start with it, the faster the accumulation and the more acceleration occurs later on when you do start young. It's investing in a pension. Now, for those who don't really know what it is, a pension is basically targeted to help you maintain a certain quality of life when you turn 65 plus, because at that point the idea is you won't be working. So to sustain your life, you'd have this investment vehicle which is ultimately going to pay for your bills over time. Now, obviously there's a state pension at the moment, but for somebody like myself where retirement is tens of years away, knowing how the government go about things, there may not be a state pension at that time. You never know. But ultimately, I decided that contributing to a pension would be a good investment vehicle to further accumulate wealth. A lot of employers, now obviously it depends on whether you work in corporate or work in a trade or whatever it is. Now, I work in corporate, so it makes sense, but my employer offered a match on how much I would contribute to a pension scheme. So what that means is if I decide to assign 8% of my gross income towards the pension, the employer would give an additional free 8% as a benefit, right? And obviously that's free money, which, to be honest, when you combine your contribution and their contribution early and you contribute for 20, 30, 40 years, you're going to have a substantial amount of money in your pension by the time you do reach retirement, which you might not think too much of now, but older you will be very appreciative of it. I think an additional beautiful thing about, you know, contributing to a pension is it kind of brings down your gross income, which means you're paying less tax, so you're getting more back, right? And that might bring you down to the lower tax brackets, which ultimately take less of your hard-earned money, which we're always grateful for, right? We don't get enough of it, especially when we're on humble salaries. In terms of what you're investing in, it's usually a combination of different investment vehicles like stocks or ETFs or bonds or whatever it is, which again usually appreciate over time as well based off historical patterns. So on top of the free money you're getting, your contributions and then compound interest, you're eventually going to have another asset worth quite a significant amount that is meaningful for you when you get older. So I decided, look, let's kind of start this. And again, future me would be thankful that I did it. That is the second investment vehicle I decided to pursue. And then the last investment vehicle that I went for, which I kind of view as a medium-term investment, I went for stocks and ETFs. I think a lot of Irish people look at stocks and ETFs poorly, in particular because of our tax laws on them. Some people might have gotten burned during the Celtic Tiger investing in a few different stocks. That's fair enough. But I think taxes here are the reason why people don't really pursue the stocks and the ETFs much. So in Ireland, we pay 33% capital gains tax on the profit made off investments in stocks, individual stocks. So if you put in 5k and it becomes 8k, so you have a profit of 3k, you pay 33% of that 3k to the government. So 1k is gone immediately. So you've made 2. And also with an ETF, which actually has harsher rules. Now, stocks, individual stocks, are obviously very risky. They're dependent on one company. A lot of people like to diversify their risk portfolio by investing in packages known as ETFs, which are basically a group of a lot of stocks designed to minimize the risk of dramatic losses. Now, people, I don't think, would complain about dramatic gains, but ultimately the risk is a lot lower because if one company does poorly and another company does well, it balances itself out. And it would take a great deal of market downturn for you to experience a lot of decreasing value in your investment. It does happen. So I do think you have to figure out what your risk profile is, your due diligence, to be very transparent. Again, I am not going to be recommending any stocks or ETFs. I'm not a financial advisor. Okay, like I said, I'm a schmuck. But at the same time, with the ETF on top of that, right? So your exit tax would be a little higher than your CGT. It would be 38%. But the real kicker for Irish people when it comes to investing in ETFs is the rule of deemed disposal. I think a lot of people don't really get it, but to be very transparent about it, regardless of whether or not you sold your investment or not, after every 8 years, you would be liable to pay exit tax on the profit you had made. So to be very transparent, with stocks, you only have to pay tax when you sell your asset. But with ETFs, every 8 years, you have to pay that 38% exit tax on the profit you've made during that time, regardless, which is obviously very crippling to compound interest and accumulation over time. And I think people are just pissed off about it, right? And out of pure spite, which you really got to appreciate about Irish people, they'd rather keep their money on deposit, right, in a bank. But to be honest, that's actually working against you, because obviously with inflation, which is referring to how the cost of living and the cost of things is going up every year, your money isn't appreciating. Your money is getting less back every year, right? So it actually makes sense to invest to a certain degree. That's not financial advice, but if you are looking to stick up with the times or at least beat inflation, you do need to kind of evaluate the options out there that will ultimately give you some bit of a return. And obviously, the higher the risk, the higher the reward. I think a good perspective on viewing exit tax and paying CGT is the fact that you're talking about the prospect of having to pay tax on profits means and implies that you've made profit, which is always a good thing. But to be very honest, you have to take accountability for the decisions you make, do your own due diligence, figure out your risk profile. I can't emphasize that enough. You are responsible for you. Nobody else is coming to save you. But at the same time, don't be afraid to make decisions. Don't be afraid to take risk if you believe in it. But it's on you, okay? But ultimately, I decided to begin investing in a few stocks that I believed in, whether it was through very humble bonuses from companies over the years, or if it was just with my remaining cash amount and the cash coming in from my regular paycheck. I started to kind of accumulate a small percentage in certain stocks, in addition to the property and pension as well. So I suppose to kind of summarize then the 100k, which I've just about got, again, like I said, not the flashiest tale, but ultimately very few tales towards this point are flashy. And if they are, they're tales that would not be applicable for the ordinary or poorer persons like ourselves. Some people get lucky overnight, like I said at the start. This is not a journey like that. This is a structured tale with a strategy, with consistency and discipline over time. But ultimately, this isn't an exact guide for you to replicate. It is my journey to how I got to my point. I would consider it perhaps and maybe nitpick what you think might be applicable for yourself. And again, do your own due diligence, because your journey is your accountability. And I really hope, especially for those of you who are struggling, I hope you know that you can rise above your situation. If somebody like myself can do it, no doubt you guys can do it too.